Welcome to Tea and Clue's channel, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unravelled. Grab your favourite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. We'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. A Hymn. Cut short. The sun rose over St. Mildred's on a gentle wave of gold, bathing the narrow streets of Stansfield in the Vale, in a light that made even the leaning chimneys and moss-flecked gravestones appear cheerful. Spring had finally taken hold, coaxing daffodils into bloom beneath the lich gate, and prompting a spirited flurry of activity in the church hall, where preparations for the Easter pageant were underway. The vicar, Reverend Lionel Groves, stood near the font, fussing with a list of hymns and peering over his glasses at the scattering of choir boys half-heartedly rehearsing under Mrs. Pembroke's stern eye. "Come now, Peter, you're 2 bars behind again," she barked gently. "You can't just mumble through the Lord's work, dear." Peter Barnes, 11, tow-headed, and often lost in his own thoughts, winced and stared harder at his sheet music. He'd never much liked singing, but his mother insisted it would build discipline, and he liked the biscuits after rehearsal well enough. His voice, when he remembered to use it, had a curious clarity, the kind that made old ladies nod in pews and whisper, "That one'll break hearts when he's older." By the time the rehearsal drew to a close, Mrs. Pembroke pronounced herself just about satisfied, which was the highest praise any of them had heard that spring. The boys were dismissed, and they scattered like a handful of dropped marbles, racing toward the green with shouts and laughter. But Peter lingered. He had left something behind, a tiny tin soldier, no taller than a thumb, that he kept tucked in his cassock's pocket for courage, his talisman. He never performed without it. He returned to the vestry alone. It was 20 minutes before anyone noticed he hadn't come home, and by supper time, when his mother's voice had grown shrill and the constable had been fetched, the village green was quiet, the church was locked, and Peter Barnes had vanished. News travels fast in any village, but in Stansfield it moved with uncanny speed. By dusk, the Black Horse Inn had fallen silent. Forks paused mid-air as Mr. Flanders, the baker, relayed what little had been confirmed. "Went missing between the vestry and the lane," he said gravely. "Door was still locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, just vanished." Mrs. Elspeth Hartwell, seated near the hearth with her crochet basket and her overgrown spaniel at her feet, sniffed loudly. "You mark my words, it'll be that Romilly boy. The new one from the poorhouse, always skulking." "Or the organist," muttered someone else. "Always looked a bit too fond of those boys." "Not a shred of proof," snapped Mrs. Hartwell. "Besides, he has a bad knee. Couldn't snatch a feather pillow, let alone a boy." "Have the police come in from Kingsbridge?" "Not yet. They're hoping he just wandered off. But it's been hours." "Maybe the child got lost," suggested Reverend Groves, who had entered unnoticed and now looked more ashen than usual. "Perhaps he's playing a game." There was silence. Everyone knew Peter was a quiet boy, not one for mischief. Mrs. Hartwell gave a pointed look toward the end of the room, where Miss Marple sat, sipping her tea with a far-away expression. "Well, if anyone can untangle it, Elspeth said, not entirely joking. "It's Jane." Miss Marple set down her cup. "I do hope the boy is merely hiding," she said softly. "But it's very unlike him to miss supper, or to leave behind his little soldier. He always keeps it in his right cassock pocket." "How on earth would you know that?" someone asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I knit the lining of that cassock," she said, "and boys don't hide treasures in the left when they're right-handed." There was a pause as the room took that in. "I dare say," she added, "we shall know more by morning. These things have a way of revealing themselves, especially in places where people think no one is watching." And with that, she turned her attention back to her tea, as though nothing more pressing lay ahead than finishing the final stitch on the doily in her handbag. But deep inside, Miss Marple already felt it. Something was very wrong in Stansfield in the Vale, and the choirboy's disappearance was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the following morning, Stansfield in the Vale had fully succumbed to a kind of nervous inertia, a hush broken only by rustling curtains, half-finished gossip, and the sharp creak of the church gate as the constable passed through for the third time that morning. Though no official statement had yet been made, everyone knew the truth they were avoiding. Peter Barnes had not come home. The vicar, looking more gaunt than usual, gave a strange service at morning, prayers, omitting the choir entirely and stumbling over the words of the collect. His hands trembled as he closed the Book of Common Prayer. Some whispered that he hadn't slept at all. Others said they'd seen him pacing the churchyard with a lantern in the early hours. By mid-morning, the small police force from Kingsbridge had arrived. Inspector Caldwell and Sergeant Thorne, both buttoned and bristled in their uniforms, looking as out of place in the village as motor cars on cobbled lanes. They questioned the vicar first, then the housekeeper, then the choir boys, one by one, assembling in the vestry like actors waiting for their cue. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Pembroke, who dabbed at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, and insisted Peter had never given her the slightest trouble. He was a quiet boy, not at all like his brother, she sniffed. Never late, never rude, always took 2 biscuits, never 3. What of his friends? Asked Miss Marple. Oh, he played a little with Gerald Ingram, though Gerald's too boisterous by half. And that Romilly child, Evan, I believe, though I can't say I encouraged it. You never know what happens when children of disparate backgrounds mix. Miss Marple inclined her head, making no comment. I suppose, Mrs. Pembroke continued, dabbing again, it's possible he ran off, but where would he go? And why? His shoes were still under the pew. Shoes? Asked Miss Marple, her eyes sharpening. Yes, Mrs. Pembroke said, surprised. One of the little ones pointed it out. He must have changed back into them, after rehearsal. Left his cassock neatly folded, too. On the bench. It was all very deliberate. Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment, watching the choir boys filing out of the hall in small, uncertain clusters, their voices subdued, like birds in the aftermath of a storm. Later that day, the search began in earnest. Constables and volunteers spread out across the surrounding fields and woods, poking at hedgerows, calling Peter's name with diminishing optimism. The well behind the rectory was checked. The mill pond was dredged. Nothing. By afternoon the atmosphere had shifted again, from fretful concern to something colder, darker. Rumours began to stir. Mrs. Elspeth Hartwell swore she'd seen a figure lurking near the cemetery wall 2 nights before. The organist's wife quietly told Mrs. Dalloway that Peter had once come home with a bruise and wouldn't say how he got it. Gerald Ingram's father said, a touch too loudly at the butcher's, that some boys were born to vanish. It was Miss Marple who quietly asked if anyone had checked the bell tower. It hadn't occurred to them the ladder up to the belfry was narrow, rickety, and rarely used, but young Evan Romilly, eager to help the search, volunteered to climb it. Moments later, his voice echoed from above, tight and breathless. "He's not here, but something else is." They brought it down gently. A book, The Adventures of Robin Hood, dog-eared and clearly much read. Inside the front cover, in faint pencil, Peter Barnes, property of Stansfield Church lending shelf. And tucked between the pages, a paper scrap, a torn corner of the hymn schedule. On it, in the same faint pencil, a single word scrawled unevenly, "Stay." Miss Marple turned it over in her hand. Her face betrayed nothing, but her eyes had grown distant. Later, back in her cottage, she placed the paper next to the soldier figurine, retrieved earlier from Peter's cassock pocket, which Mrs. Pembroke had handed over without thought. "I do hope," she murmured, "that he's still somewhere he can be reached." The doorbell rang. It was Gerald Ingram. I heard you were helping," he stammered. "I didn't do anything, honest. But I saw Peter that afternoon, just before rehearsal." She looked up at him gently. "And what was he doing, Gerald?" He shifted nervously. "Talking to someone. I couldn't see who, just a shadow behind the vestry curtain." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Thank you, Gerald," she said, her voice soft. "You've been very helpful." And in that moment she was quite sure someone in the village was not telling the whole truth. And whatever Peter had meant by that one word, "stay," it had not been written for himself. Chapter 3. The Patterns People Leave Behind. Wednesday morning, the village green was quiet, though the tension beneath its surface had only grown more taut. There was something unnatural in the stillness of it all. The way shop doors creaked, opened too slowly, the way neighbours nodded a beat too quickly, as if trying to prove nothing had changed. But Stansfield in the Vale was holding its breath. Inspector Caldwell had taken over the schoolroom to use as a temporary base, and the sight of him there, broad-shouldered and unblinking, seemed to throw the entire village into retreat. People kept their eyes lowered, their conversations muted. They were afraid now, not only for Peter Barnes, but of what else might be uncovered. Miss Marple, of course, did not retreat. She spent the morning taking a leisurely walk to the rectory, pausing to observe the comings and goings of villagers with a serene expression and a keenly working mind. At one point, she stopped outside the churchyard to examine the footpath. It had rained the night before, and the softened soil held impressions. The heavier tread of boots, the narrow daintiness of a child's sole, a single scuff mark with a turned heel. They weren't fresh enough to be meaningful, perhaps. But she'd always believed you could tell everything about a person by the patterns they left behind. She continued to the rectory, where Reverend Groves welcomed her with a fragile sort of gratitude. "I don't know what else to do," he confessed as he poured her tea with trembling hands. "The boy's poor mother is beside herself, and the press is beginning to call. I never imagined anything like this could happen in Stansfield." "Most villages," Miss Marple said, "are like lace. From a distance they appear simple, but look closely, and you'll find all manner of knots and threads crossing where you least expect them." Groves gave a miserable nod. "Was Peter troubled, Reverend?" "Not that I saw. He was quiet, thoughtful. He often stayed behind after rehearsal to tidy up. Once I found him in the pews, just sitting. I asked what he was doing, and he said, 'Listening.' He gave a small, helpless laugh. I told him the church was empty. He replied, 'Not to me.'" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at her teacup. "And the other children? I try not to play favourites, but some are more sensitive than others. Gerald Ingram, well-meaning, but easily led. Evan Romilly, bright, perhaps too bright, and lonely." "Because of his background?" Groves looked troubled. "Yes, his father drank, you see. Evan came to us through the charity school after his father died. His mother's housekeeper now for the Brancasters." Said Miss Marple, tucking that name away. "And the organist?" "Mr. Felden, a good man, reserved perhaps, a bit obsessive. I believe he fought in the war." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is he left-handed by chance?" Groves blinked. "Why, yes, I believe he is." "Curious," she murmured. "Why do you ask?" But Miss Marple only smiled her vague, polite smile and asked for more sugar. Meanwhile, the search for Peter had shifted from hopeful to procedural. The police questioned Evan Romilly again, this time with more insistence. He was small, sharp-eyed, and anxious, his hands constantly picking at the frayed cuff of his sleeve. "He didn't say where he was going," Evan said for the second time. "We were just talking. He said he had something to do." "And what was that?" asked Sergeant Thorne. "I don't know," Evan said. "He looked scared. Not like someone who was running away, like someone who was being watched." Thorne exchanged a glance with the inspector, who muttered something about troublemakers under his breath. Miss Marple had been watching quietly from the edge of the green. She stepped forward now, her manner pleasant, her tone feather-light. "Evan, dear," she said gently, "did Peter ever say if he was afraid of anyone?" The boy looked at her. "Not afraid, just confused. He said someone told him to keep a secret, that it was a special kind of secret." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "Did he say who?" Evan hesitated. "No, but he said it had to do with the vestry curtain. That's where he was when he said it. Said that's where he heard it." She gave him a kind smile. "Thank you, Evan. That's most helpful." And as Evan was led back toward the schoolhouse, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward St. Mildred's once more, toward the soft rise of the vestry windows and the curtain drawn inside them. She remembered the single-scrawled word on the torn hymn sheet. Stay. Stay where? Not for safety. That word had been a command, and she was quite sure of it now. Someone had told Peter Barnes exactly what to do that afternoon, and perhaps where to go. The question was, why? And what had they needed him to see? Or worse, not see at all? Chapter 4. Shadows in the Choir Loft. The next morning the mood in Stansfield in the Vale had grown brittle, as though the village were bracing itself for something it could not name. The searches had become more methodical, systematic, and increasingly hopeless. The woods beyond the parish boundaries had been combed twice. Outbuildings and barns were inspected. The mill stream was checked again. Yet there was still no sign of Peter Barnes. What there was, instead, was talk. Whispers that darted behind, lace curtains, growing more imaginative by the hour. "It's a punishment," said Mrs. Bletchley at the post office, her voice trembling with satisfaction. Too much pride in that choir. Always rehearsing, always performing. Mark my words, some sins hide in plain sight. At the Black Horse Inn, a group of younger men argued in hushed tones about calling in journalists, until the barkeep, Mr. Renner, threatened to throw them out if they stirred up more trouble. Even at the church, murmurs floated like incense. The vestry felt colder now. The choir loft especially had taken on a kind of reverence, as though the absence of Peter had sanctified the space in the most morbid of ways. Miss Marple, of course, had not wasted the day in idle speculation. Instead, she returned to St. Mildred's that morning with a soft wool shawl over her shoulders and a polite request to examine the church interior. The verger, Mr. Nash, grunted his assent. He had known Miss Marple since he was a lad, and knew better than to question her quiet persistence. She walked slowly down the nave, taking in the stonework, the brass plaques, the dust dancing in the light cast through the stained-glass windows. She stopped before the vestry door, which stood ajar. Inside, the air was still and musty with the scent of candle-wax and old vestments. On the far wall, the curtain still hung. Miss Marple studied it carefully. It was a thick thing, green velvet, with a fringe of gold at the hem, and drawn across a low shelf used to conceal storage, the sort of curtain a child might hide behind if told to wait, or the sort behind which someone might whisper something private, something dangerous. She knelt, slowly, carefully, and peered beneath the heavy fabric. Dust, scuff marks, a small tear in the lining, revealing a fragment of wood panelling. She reached in and withdrew something, flat and pale, a playing card, the King of Hearts. Curious. Miss Marple turned it over. The back was patterned in faded red diamonds, worn at the edges. A child might have found such a thing amusing, or perhaps a man with a fondness for riddles. She placed it gently into her handbag. Later, in the garden behind the vicarage, she sat with Reverend Groves again. He was paler than before, but less shaken, as though sleep had finally come to him in the night. "You knew Peter's family well, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked, plucking at a strand of her knitting. "Well, enough," said Groves. "His father's been gone nearly 5 years. Heart trouble. The mother, Edith, hard-working, respectable. She's never caused a bit of trouble. Peter was her quiet one. The older brother, Matthew, he's the bold sort." "Bold?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Oh, not in a bad way. Just headstrong. Left school early. Works for the coal merchant now. Takes after his uncle, a real spitfire in his youth. Edith tries to keep the boys grounded, but—" He trailed off with a helpless shrug. "And Peter? Did he ever express concern about anything or anyone in the church?" Groves looked momentarily startled. "Not to me. He once asked if the dead could speak through dreams, but I thought that was just childish musing. He was sensitive, Missy." Marple smiled. Children notice far more than we credit them for, especially the quiet ones. He nodded. I wish I had listened better. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the choir loft. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the pews below. She climbed the wooden stairs slowly, her steps barely making a sound. The loft was narrow and steeply pitched, with a view of the entire nave. It was the kind of place one could sit unseen and watch everything. She examined the floorboards. One was looser than the rest. Kneeling, she pried it upward. Inside was a folded length of paper, a torn sheet from an old church ledger. She unfolded it with care. Written across it in hurried, untidy pencil were 2 lines. He said it's just pretend, but it felt like a real secret. Miss Marple stared at the words for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she folded the paper, added it to her handbag beside the playing card, and replaced the floorboard. Down below, the door creaked open. Mrs. Pembroke stepped inside, a bundle of choir robes in her arms. "Oh," she said, seeing Miss Marple on the stairs. "I didn't think anyone was here." "I was admiring the view," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "One sees so much more from above." Mrs. Pembroke gave a faint smile, her fingers tightening slightly on the robes. Chapter 5. First Suspects and False Trails. By Friday morning, the search had taken on the hollow rhythms of routine. Villagers now walked in pairs instead of groups, and the countryside had been combed so thoroughly that hedgerows seemed half the size they were a week ago. Still no trace of Peter Barnes. The police, weary and without leads, had begun to turn their attention inward, toward character assessments, associations, and history. And inevitably, suspicion found its way to Evan Romilly. He was not from the village, not exactly. Though he had lived there nearly 2 years, he had never been fully of Stansfield. His mother's employment with the Brancaster household gave him a roof and a place at school, but not belonging. He was too clever, too quiet, and above all, too different. Miss Marple observed the shift with a disquieted gaze. She had seen it before. How communities, when frightened, clutched at the unfamiliar to blame. Evan had been pulled from school that morning, officially for questioning, though no one used the word aloud. The boy sat in the corner of the schoolroom, legs swinging nervously beneath a chair too tall for him. Inspector Caldwell leaned forward at the desk, frowning like a disappointed uncle. "You said Peter told you he was scared," Caldwell repeated. Evan nodded. "Scared of what? I don't know. He wouldn't say. But he said someone told him to keep a secret." Evan hesitated, glancing sideways at the constable who stood by the door. Then he nodded again. "And you didn't think to tell anyone before?" I was afraid," Evan said, his voice small. "He told me not to. He said if anyone found out, it would ruin everything." "Ruin what, exactly?" Evan looked down at his feet. "He didn't say." Outside the schoolroom, Miss Marple had listened long enough to understand that Evan would not be of further help. Not because he was lying, but because he genuinely didn't know more. Or if he did, it had been buried beneath the confusing weight of childish loyalty and fear. She excused herself and stepped back out onto the green. The day was bright but chilly, the kind of sunlight that gave no warmth. Across the way, she spotted Gerald Ingram walking beside his father, head bowed. She crossed to intercept them. "Good morning, Mr. Ingram." "Gerald," she said warmly. The elder Ingram grunted. "Miss Marple." Gerald looked up. "Hello." "I wonder, Gerald, if I might ask you something," she said, "about the day Peter disappeared." Mr. Ingram scowled. "The boy said his piece, Miss Marple. No need to dredge it up." "I assure you, I mean no trouble. Just a small thing I've been wondering about." Gerald looked at his father, who sighed and folded his arms. 5 minutes. Miss Marple crouched slightly to Gerald's level, a soft smile playing on her face. "You said before you saw Peter speaking to someone behind the vestry curtain?" "Yes," Gerald replied. "I saw a shadow." "And you're sure it was a person?" Gerald hesitated. "Well, it moved, like someone standing just behind. It was too tall to be Peter." "Was it the vicar?" "No, I'd have known. The vicar wears a long robe with that cord thing, and he walks differently." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "What about the organist, Mr. Felden?" Gerald's brow furrowed. "Maybe. He's quiet. I don't remember hearing anything." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "And did you see Peter come back out?" "No. I ran off before that. Mum was calling me. Thank you, Gerald. You've been most helpful." She straightened and nodded to Mr. Ingram, who muttered something non-committal before leading his son away. By midday, Inspector Caldwell had turned his attention to Mr. Felden, the organist. "Quiet man," he muttered to Sergeant Thorne. "Odd fussy. Carries on like a clockmaker with those hymn arrangements. Lives alone in the cottage behind the chapel. Did you see the way he twitched when I asked about Peter?" "Guilt?" asked Thorne. "Or nerves? But it's something." They visited the cottage that afternoon. Miss Marple did not accompany them, but she arrived shortly after they left. Mr. Felden opened the door a sliver at first. His eyes, pale and watery behind wire-rimmed spectacles, widened when he saw her. "Miss Marple, I thought I'd bring you this," she said kindly, lifting a basket wrapped in a linen cloth. "Seed cake. You always did enjoy it." He'd opened the door a little more. "That's very kind." She stepped inside. The cottage was tidy, with a strong scent of pipe smoke and lemon oil. The piano sat open in the corner. Sheet music spread across it like fallen leaves. Most of the books on the shelf were hymnals and theory. They sat for a moment, sipping tea. Miss Marple admired the neatness of the room, the meticulous placement of every object. "You heard they questioned Evan again?" she said mildly. Felden nodded. "Poor child. You think he's innocent, then?" Felden blinked. "Of course, he's only a boy." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what of Peter Barnes?" Chapter 6. A Hidden Clue On. Saturday morning, as the village hung in a fog of rumours and restless grief, Miss Marple ventured toward the Brancaster estate. It was a large ivy-clad house on the eastern edge of Stansfield, aloof from the rest of the village in both geography and spirit. The Brancasters had been landed gentry for 3 generations, and though their fortune had waned with time, their heirs had not. Miss Marple had no interest in their pedigree. She had come, quite deliberately, to speak with their housekeeper, Mrs. Romilly. The woman answered the door with flour on her apron and worry on her face. She had the look of someone who had spent the past few nights pacing rooms and peering through windows. "I don't suppose this is a social visit," she said. "Not entirely," said Miss Marple, with that gentle smile that often disarmed even the most cautious of souls. "May I come in?" She was shown into the modest side parlour, where the furniture was well kept, but clearly once belonged in grander rooms. A tea service was already laid out, though it looked untouched. "I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said. "I only hoped to ask a few questions about Evan." Mrs. Romilly's face tightened. "He didn't do anything. He's a good boy. He reads, he keeps to himself, he helps in the garden. He's no more capable of harming Peter Barnes than I am." "I don't doubt that," Miss Marple said kindly. "But sometimes good boys see things they don't understand. Things they tuck away because they don't know how to explain them." Mrs. Romilly's fingers tightened around her teacup. "There's something I think you should know," she said after a moment, her voice low. "Evan came home last week with a torn bit of paper. I didn't think much of it at the time. He's always scribbling things or saving notes. But this one was different. He wouldn't let me throw it away. Do you still have it?" She disappeared into the hallway and returned a moment later with a crumpled sheet. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was a church programme from the previous Sunday, creased and smudged with fingerprints. But in the margin, near the bottom, a short phrase was scrawled in the same unsteady pencil as the one found earlier in the belfry. "He said hearts can be tricks too." Miss Marple blinked. Another reference to war-he, and that word again. Hearts. First, the King of Hearts, and now this. "Do you recall when Evan brought this home? The day before Peter went missing," said Mrs. Romilly. "He said he found it near the side door of the church. Thought it was just a scrap." Miss Marple nodded, gently tucking the programme into her handbag beside the others. "I do appreciate your help," she said. "One more question. Have you ever heard Peter mention anyone he feared, not a boy his age, but someone older?" Mrs. Romilly frowned. "No, but once Evan said Peter was afraid of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I asked what that meant, but Evan just shrugged. I thought it was something from a book." "Perhaps it was," Miss Marple said quietly. "Or perhaps it was something else." That afternoon she returned to St. Mildred's alone. The church was empty, save for the faint echo of wind through the stone arches. She moved slowly through the pews, pausing at the vestry door and then walking the length of the side aisle. Her shoes tapped softly against the stone floor. She paused at the votive candlestand and lit one, just one. Its light trembled in the silence. Then she turned and examined the stained-glass window near the organ, a scene depicting St. George and the dragon, with deep reds and blues that caught the sun. But it wasn't the window that caught her eye. It was the small wooden bench beneath it. Worn from years of parishioners resting on it, the bench bore a peculiar scuff mark near its base. Just above it, along the skirting board, was a faint smudge. Grease, perhaps, or wax. She crouched, adjusted her shawl, and ran a hand along the baseboard. There, wedged into the gap between wall and bench, was a slip of folded cloth. Dark green, velvet, clearly a piece torn from the vestry curtain. She opened it carefully. Inside, a second playing card, the Jack of Hearts. her breath caught just slightly. The first card had been the king, now the jack. She turned the card over. On the reverse, in tiny scratchy pencil, the game ends when someone wins. Miss Marple folded the cloth slowly, her fingers deliberate. A pattern was forming. She had seen it before, years ago in a London boarding school, when a quiet girl had accused another of stealing love letters she had never written. The truth had turned out to be a twisted game of attention-seeking, led by a boy who had learned early how to control others without ever appearing cruel. And now, here in Stansfield, someone was playing a game with hearts, with symbols, with a frightened child, and Peter Barnes, clever and sensitive Peter, had realized it too late. Miss Marple rose, brushing invisible dust from her skirt, and crossed to Chapter 7. Another twist in the game. The news broke just after evensong on Sunday, when the weary village had just begun to settle into a rhythm of uneasy silence. It came, as so many village events do, through Mrs. Chilton, who burst into the vicarage clutching her umbrella and announced in breathless tones, "They've found something in the well behind the old rectory. Cloth, they say, dark like a robe. Could be Peter's." Within the hour, Inspector Caldwell had roped off the crumbling stone well, which sat half-hidden beneath brambles on the overgrown property of the original rectory, abandoned since the war, and left to the ivy. Miss Marple arrived on foot not long after, already sensing that this moment would bring with it a crucial change in the shape of the case. The inspector gave her a glance that was equal parts irritation and weary resignation. "You're wasting your time, Miss Marple," he said. "This is a police matter." "As most things are when something terrible happens," she said gently. "But it's been my experience, Inspector, that terrible things are also often very human things, and that's rather more in my realm." He grunted, but made no attempt to send her away. The well had indeed yielded something, a damp, crumpled robe. It was the choir robe belonging to Peter Barnes, his initials faintly stitched into the inner collar. There was no blood, no visible damage, but the robe had been knotted at the sleeves and filled with heavy stones. Someone had intended to weigh it down and make it disappear. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the clearing, took in the details with quiet solemnity. She watched the constables with their canvas bags and gloves, heard their clipped reports, and saw, most importantly, the absence of grief on any of their faces. They hadn't found Peter. Only the idea of him, a decoy. "I don't believe he's in there," she said aloud. Caldwell turned. "No? If someone wanted to hide a body, they wouldn't leave the robe on top. Not unless they wanted it to be found." "You think someone's trying to mislead us?" Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, she turned to the low stone wall surrounding the clearing and ran her fingers along its edge. It was covered in moss, but beneath the growth, the stone was chipped, deliberately, as if struck by something heavy. She looked up. "The robe was placed recently," she said. "The fabric is damp, but not rotted. The knot is fresh. This was a message." Inspector Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "And what was it trying to say?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "That Peter is gone, and it's too late to ask why." That evening the village was awash in speculation. In the Black Horse, the drinkers spoke in solemn tones, some sympathetic, others strangely triumphant, as though the revelation of the robe had vindicated their worst suspicions. Evan Romilly, once again, bore the brunt of the suspicion. His silence, his withdrawn manner, and his tenuous connection to Peter made him an easy scapegoat. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned home and laid the cards out again. King, Jack, and now the invisible third. 3 figures, 3 rolls. In the games children play, especially the cruel ones, there's always a pecking order, a leader, a follower, and a victim. She thought again of Peter's scribbled words. He said hearts can be tricks too. It wasn't about playing cards. It was about trust. Peter had trusted someone older, cleverer, perhaps admired, and that trust had led him into danger. On Monday morning, Miss Marple visited the church one final time, before the police closed off the vestry for evidence handling. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and melted candle wax. The choir loft remained empty, the organ untouched. She moved to the side chapel and paused before the candle rack. Her fingers traced the brass edge, then dropped to the ledge just beneath. There, tucked behind the candle box, was the third card. Tiush, Ace of Hearts. Unlike the others, this one bore no note, but Miss Marple did not need one. The ace was always the beginning, the first move. She held it for a long moment, then tucked it into her handbag beside the others. Peter had known not the full truth, but enough to leave behind a trail. King, Jack, Ace. She thought of the children again. Gerald Ingram, bright but easily led. Evan, intelligent and strange. And Peter, who had been quiet and watchful. And she thought of the adults who shaped their lives. Mr. Felden, with his lonely cottage and sharp discipline. Mrs. Pembroke, with her stern benevolence. Reverend Groves, kind but blind in his trust. And someone else, someone who had not yet shown their full hand. But the game was nearly at an end now. Miss Marple closed her handbag, adjusted her shawl, and turned back toward the village, where the final act was waiting to unfold. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test on Tuesday morning. The village woke to grey skies and a hush that was not quite peace. Word had spread that the police had all but closed the case. The choir robe in the well was being treated as evidence of Peter Barnes's likely death, though no body had been recovered. Inspector Caldwell was preparing to issue a public statement by the end of the week. Some in the village sighed with relief. Miss Marple, however, felt the quiet settling far too soon. She spent much of the morning in her parlour, the curtains drawn just enough to watch the road outside. The kettle steamed beside her as she laid the 3 playing cards, King, Jack, Ace, on her tea tray. Her eyes lingered on the ace. The beginning of the game. Only one person in Stansfield had consistently tried to stay behind the curtains of suspicion. One person who had both access to the vestry and a reason to orchestrate misdirection. But proving it would require more than quiet intuition. It would require one last test. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage with a sealed envelope tucked in her handbag. The vicar was out visiting a parishioner, but Mrs. Pembroke was there, seated by the window with her mending. "Dear Miss Marple," she said warmly, standing to greet her. "What a week it has been. I do hope the village can begin to heal." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, settling into a nearby chair. "Though healing often requires truth, don't you think?" Mrs. Pembroke looked up. Her needle paused mid-stitch. "Naturally, but I suppose truth can be difficult. Not so difficult, I find, when one listens closely to children." "Children?" Mrs. Pembroke's smile stiffened. "They are rarely reliable." "They can be," Miss Marple said, retrieving the envelope. "I found this in the church. It appears to be written in Peter's hand." Mrs. Pembroke did not move, but her shoulders lifted ever so slightly. Miss Marple passed it to her. She didn't open it. Instead, her fingers pressed against the paper, testing the contents, perhaps, or measuring the weight of what it might contain. "You're certain it's his?" she asked after a long pause. "Quite. It was tucked behind the candle box. The third and final card, too, was there, the ace. Peter left a message for someone. I don't see what that proves." "It proves," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone knew Peter was afraid, and that someone chose to silence him, not with violence perhaps, but with pressure, subtle, persuasive pressure." Mrs. Pembroke's lips trembled. "That's a very serious accusation." "No accusation at all," Miss Marple replied. "But I do wonder, was it you who encouraged Peter to come early on Wednesdays? To help you tidy the vestry?" The needle dropped into her lap. "I never meant him harm," she said quietly. He was a bright boy, and he knew something about Mr. Felden." "Something inappropriate?" "No, at least I don't believe so. But he overheard a conversation between Felden and Reverend Groves, something to do with an old debt. Peter told me about it, said he was going to tell the inspector. I couldn't let him stir up scandal, not when the vicar has done so much for this parish." "So you frightened him?" I told him if he stirred trouble, no one would believe him, that he might be sent away." Miss Marple sighed. "And that is precisely the sort of cruelty children never forget." Mrs. Pembroke closed her eyes. "I only meant to protect the church, by protecting the secrets of men who do not deserve it." There was a long silence between them. Finally, Mrs. Pembroke whispered, "I didn't know he would vanish. I thought he would get over it. But he didn't, and now someone has made sure we think he won't come back." Miss Marple stood and gently took back the envelope. "For what it's worth, I don't believe Peter is dead." Mrs. Pembroke blinked. "You don't?" "No," Miss Marple said, "because the robe in the well was planted, and because Peter left his clues deliberately. A child who's been frightened into silence doesn't leave messages unless he's trying to be found." She offered a brief smile. "Perhaps it is time you helped that happen." That evening, Miss Marple visited the Romilleys one last time. Evan was in the garden, tending the petunias as though nothing in the world had changed. But when he saw Miss Marple, he rose and walked over, eyes steady. "He's not dead, is he?" he asked. "I don't believe so." Evan nodded. "I didn't think so either. Peter's clever. He said he had a plan." "A plan? To get away, to scare someone, to make them think he'd disappeared. But then," Evan looked down, "he stopped talking about it. I think he got scared again." Miss Marple knelt beside him. Do you know where he might go? Evan hesitated. There's a place, in the woods, past the mill path. An old stone hut. We called it the King's House. Because it was secret, she placed a hand gently on his. Would you show me? He nodded, and so, with dusk falling and the village unaware, Miss Marple followed Evan into Chapter 9. The King's House. The woods beyond Stansfield were old and tangled, more forgotten than feared. Children had long spun tales of secret kingdoms among its trees, stories passed like whispers, half believed and half dismissed. Yet led the way with a surprising calmness for a boy so young. Miss Marple followed, her walking stick steady against the forest floor, her shawl drawn close against the gathering chill. The sun had slipped low, casting long shadows between the trees. They walked in silence until the well-worn path narrowed and veered sharply down a gully. At its base, half hidden beneath overgrowth, sat a moss-covered stone structure, what had once been a gamekeeper's lodge, now nothing more than a ruin. There, Evan said softly, pointing. Miss Marple's breath misted before her. She stepped forward carefully, her eyes scanning every branch and stone. "Peter?" she called, her voice gentle but firm. "Peter Barnes, it's Miss Marple." Silence, then a rustle, barely more than a breath, and a faint shifting from behind the low doorway. Miss Marple moved no closer. She waited, and then from the gloom a small figure emerged, dirt-smudged, hollow-eyed, but unmistakably Peter Barnes. He looked at her with a mix of defiance and fear, like a bird unsure whether it should fly or freeze. "You found me," he said. Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "Not I, Evan." Peter looked at his friend, who had hung back near the tree line. "I didn't tell," Evan said. "I promised, but Miss Marple, she guessed." Peter's lip trembled. "I wasn't going to stay forever," he said quickly. I wanted them to stop. I wanted to scare them." Miss Marple approached slowly and sat on the worn stone step. "Start from the beginning, dear. Slowly." Peter sank beside her, knees pulled to his chest. "It started weeks ago. Someone left a card in my hymnal, a King of Hearts. I thought it was a joke. But then there was another, behind the curtain in the vestry. The Jack." His voice trembled, and then notes telling me not to talk, to keep quiet about what I'd seen. "What had you seen?" Peter hesitated. "Mr. Felden and Mrs. Pembroke, in the vestry, late. I think they were arguing about money. I didn't mean to listen, but I couldn't move. I was scared they'd see me. I told Gerald, and he said I should tell someone. But then the cards started appearing. I got scared, thought maybe someone else knew." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So you ran?" Peter shook his head. "I didn't mean to vanish. I just wanted to make them worry, make them think I was serious. But when the robe went missing, I knew it had gone too far. The robe wasn't your doing. No, I think someone else took it. Maybe they thought I'd told?" Miss Marple felt the cold tighten in her chest. "Someone trying to seal the story, or distract the police." Peter glanced down. "I didn't mean for Evan to get blamed. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you knew he would." Peter looked ashamed. "I left the cards," he admitted. I thought someone would understand, but I didn't know who to trust. You trusted the wrong people, perhaps. But that can be mended." She stood and extended a hand. "Come now, it's time to come home." They returned under cover of dusk. Miss Marple sent Evan ahead to alert Mrs. Romilly and Inspector Caldwell, though she asked him to say nothing of the cards or the stone lodge. The truth, she knew, would need to come in layers. By the time they reached the Romilly house, a small group had gathered, Mrs. Romilly weeping, Caldwell fuming, and the village already stirring with fresh gossip. Peter stood silently beside Miss Marple, as Caldwell demanded to know where he had been, what had happened, why he had run. The boy answered simply, "I was scared. I didn't trust anyone." Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet, because the trap had not been sprung. The real game, Peter's game, was not over. The final piece would fall into place soon. And when it did, she would be waiting. Not with accusation, but with understanding, and, as ever, the quiet, lethal truth. Chapter 10. The Calm. Before the Reveal. By Wednesday morning, the village was buzzing with a new energy. Half relief, half suspicion. Peter Barnes was home. Alive, if pale and exhausted, and now being watched over by Mrs. Romilly, as though he were a porcelain saint. Inspector Caldwell had issued a restrained statement declaring the boy in good health, though the inspector's mood had curdled once more into resentment at having been outmanoeuvred. Miss Marple, for her part, kept herself busy that day, not with knitting, but with tea. That is to say, she hosted tea, a quiet affair. No invitations, no formalities, just a few cups, a freshly baked seed cake, and a murmured word here and there at the grocer's or the post office. Before long, as she had predicted, the key players found their way to her sitting room at intervals. Gerald Ingram, pale and twitching at the sleeve, Mrs. Pembroke, stern and tight-lipped, and most curiously, Mr. Felden. He came last, his hat in hand, and his fingers fretting along the brim. "I heard the boys returned," he said, attempting cheer. Miss Marple offered him a cup. "Indeed, he's recovering nicely. A quiet child, but sharp, not easily frightened." Mr. Felden glanced toward the window. "Well, it's good news, and I dare say there's little more to be said." "Oh, on the contrary," said Miss Marple mildly. "There's everything to be said, especially now that Peter's no longer missing." She placed a small slip of paper on the table between them. It was the Ace of Hearts. Mr. Felden did not touch it, but she saw the corner of his mouth flicker, just once. "A curious choice," she went on. "You see, the King of Hearts came first, then the Jack, then the Ace. Most would assume the order should be reversed. But Peter, I think, was trying to tell a story." She smiled at him as though discussing a nursery rhyme. "A game, you see, a game with 3 players. The King, older, commanding. The Jack, slippery, easily led. And the Ace, the true beginning. The boy who sees everything and says nothing until it's too late." Felden's knuckles whitened around his teacup. "I dare say you've given it far more thought than a child's prank deserves," he said, voice brittle. "Oh, I quite agree. It would be foolish to dwell on children's games. Unless, of course, those games mirror something quite real." She leaned forward, her voice barely more than a murmur. Peter didn't vanish because he was rebellious. He vanished because someone tried to frighten him into silence. And when that didn't work, when he left clues instead, someone else tried to make it seem final. The robe in the well, the misdirection. Felden stood abruptly. "I must be going. I imagine you must," Miss Marple said gently. "But do consider, Mr. Felden, consider who else might be playing your game, because I assure you, Peter is not the only one who knows the truth." After he left, Miss Marple penned a short note and sent it via a neighbour's boy to Inspector Caldwell. It said only this: "Please gather all relevant parties in the vestry at St. Mildred's tomorrow evening. I believe the final truth will be best served in the place where it began." And so, that Thursday evening, as the sun dipped behind the bell tower and the last light scattered stained glass across the church floor, the villagers filed quietly into the vestry. Mrs. Pembroke, rigid as carved stone, Gerald Ingram, wringing his cap, Mr. Felden, expressionless and stiff, the Reverend Groves, looking like a man who had misplaced something terribly important. Peter Barnes stood at the back, hand in Evans, quiet but steady, and Miss Marple, as always, was the last to arrive. She took her place before the group, set her handbag down, and folded her hands over it. "My friends," she said, "the time has come to speak plainly." She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Outside, the first notes of evening rain tapped against the stained glass, like a slow, steady heartbeat, and inside, the final game was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Truth in the Vestry. The vestry was lit with a single hanging lamp, which cast elongated shadows across the panelled walls and polished floor. It smelled of old hymnals and stone dampness, with the faintest scent of incense still clinging to the air. Everyone assembled looked at Miss Marple, but she wasn't looking at them, at least not directly. Her gaze moved between them like a finger through fog, tracing lines they couldn't yet see. "You'll forgive the setting," she said, placing her handbag on the worn altar table. "But it felt appropriate. We so rarely confront truth in the place where lies are usually spoken most carefully." Mrs. Pembroke bristled at the remark. Gerald Ingram looked confused. Mr. Felden remained still, eyes unreadable. "The boy is safe," Inspector Caldwell said from the back, where he stood, with arms crossed. "If you know something more, Miss Marple, say it plainly." She inclined her head. "Very well, Inspector. Let's begin at the beginning. Not with Peter's disappearance, but with a different event. A conversation in this very vestry. One overheard by Peter Barnes, which involved Mr. Felden and Mrs. Pembroke." Mrs. Pembroke straightened, her voice icy. "I explained to you, Miss Marple, that conversation was entirely innocent, about parish finances and nothing more." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "but not everyone in the room was convinced of its innocence. Peter was hiding behind the curtain that day, perhaps even before either of you arrived, and he heard enough to believe someone was in trouble, or being threatened." Miss Marple turned slightly. "You see, Peter is not a boy who leaps to conclusions, but he is a boy who sees connections. He noticed, for instance, that you, Mrs. Pembroke, seemed oddly afraid of Mr. Felden, and that you, Mr. Felden, began watching Peter far too closely for a man who had no concern in the matter." Mr. Felden's expression tightened. Miss Marple continued calmly. And then the cards began to appear, first in Peter's hymnal, then in the vestry, and finally hidden behind the candle-box. A game, yes, but a calculated one. One designed to frighten him, to make him believe he was being watched, manipulated, hunted. She opened her handbag and laid the 3 playing cards on the altar table, the king, the jack, and the ace of hearts. A trinity of power, obedience, and vulnerability. Peter was the ace. The jack, I believe, was Gerald. All eyes turned toward the boy, who shrank beneath their stares. "I didn't do anything," he cried. "I didn't know what the cards meant." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "But someone did. Someone gave them to you and asked you to pass them along. As a joke, they said, as part of a game." Gerald's mouth opened. "Closed. He told me to," he whispered. "Mr. Felden. He said it would help keep Peter out of trouble. That he was getting too nosy." Caldwell stepped forward, frowning. "Felden? Is this true?" Mr. Felden's voice, when it came, was cold and quiet. "Children are foolish. I was trying to scare him a little, yes, but nothing more. It got out of hand. You planted the robe in the well." "I didn't harm the boy," Felden snapped, "and I didn't lie to you. I thought if people believed he'd run off for good, it would all fade away. These things, they spiral." Miss Marple's voice, ever mild, cut through his words, like a thread through linen. "And what were you trying to make fade away, Mr. Felden? The debt you owed the church funds? Or the growing awareness that someone, perhaps Peter, might uncover it?" Silence, then a sigh, resigned, bitter. "I've served this parish for 20 years, he said. "You think I intended to hurt him? I only wanted to protect what little dignity I had left." "By frightening a child into silence?" Miss Marple shook her head. "He came to you for guidance, and you turned it into a test of power." Reverend Groves stepped forward at last, his face pale. "Is this true, Felden? You told me the accounts were balanced." Felden didn't answer. The silence was enough. It was Caldwell who placed a hand on Felden's shoulder and led him away. No handcuffs yet, no formal arrest, but enough gravity in his footsteps to suggest things would not be hushed this time. Gerald slumped against the wall, eyes wide. Mrs. Pembroke said nothing, but her face had turned a terrible shade of grey. Miss Marple turned to Peter. "You were brave," she said, "and clever. But you must never believe again that you have to run to be safe. The truth doesn't need to hide." Peter looked down, and then at last gave a small nod. Tomorrow would bring questions, gossip, consequences. But tonight, at last, the vestry was quiet. Chapter 12. Reflections over Tea. The village of Stansfield had seen many a disturbance in its long history. Floods, fires, the war years. But few had unsettled it like the disappearance of Peter Barnes. And fewer still had left such a complex echo in its parlour rooms, church pews, and corner shop queues. For a week after the vestry confrontation, the talk in Stansfield was unending. Though, as Miss Marple would note with her characteristic delicacy, not always productive. Mr. Felden had formally resigned his post. The diocesan committee would no doubt take weeks to issue a full accounting of his conduct. But his quiet departure and the sudden balancing of the church's books spoke volumes to those who had eyes to see. Mrs. Pembroke, once a bulwark of respectability, found herself keeping to the shadows more than the spotlight. She did not resign from her various village committees, but her voice lost its usual certainty at meetings, and she no longer looked Miss Marple directly in the eye. As for Gerald Ingram, he resumed his schooling with a grave solemnity not common to boys his age. He avoided Peter for a time, more from guilt than rejection, and it was not until the following spring, at the Easter choir recital, that the two shared a glance of mutual, if wordless, understanding. Peter himself stayed quiet, not silent, never, again that, but watchful. The cards he had once hidden were never mentioned, nor were the names he had feared to speak. He returned to the choir loft without complaint, and though he kept his voice low in the hymns, he stood tall when singing them. One mild Friday, with the daffodils beginning to pierce the lawn and a fresh pot of orange pekoe steeping in the parlour, Miss Marple sat opposite Reverend Groves, who had requested her company with a note that read only, "For a matter of closure." He stirred his tea slowly, eyes thoughtful behind rimless spectacles. "I suppose," he said at last, "I failed Peter, in ways I'm still beginning to understand." Miss Marple smiled softly. "I suspect we all do in small ways. Children notice what we think they miss, and they feel more deeply than they show." Groves nodded. "You believed him before anyone else did." "I listened to him, Reverend. That is not the same thing, but often much more important." He looked up, brows drawn. "What was it that told you Mr. Felden was involved? That it wasn't just a runaway boy and an overactive imagination?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. There were too many performances, people pretending not to be, afraid when they were, Mrs. Pembroke's insistence on silence, Mr. Felden's sudden concern, even Peter's clues, left like breadcrumbs but not leading to a body, no one truly grieving, and yet everyone talking of death. It was too theatrical. She tapped her teaspoon against her saucer. "Also, I have long observed that when someone wishes to frighten another person, they rarely do so directly. Cards, symbols, whispers, they speak in shadows. Mr. Felden was a man who had grown accustomed to authority, but had lost the moral right to wield it." She paused, and Peter, bless him, recognized that. Groves leaned back, exhaling slowly. "It's strange. We always assume we protect children. We forget how often they are the ones protecting us from the truths we refuse to see." Miss Marple chuckled quietly. "You sound more like a philosopher than a clergyman today." He gave a wry smile. "Perhaps I'll be both in time." Outside, children's voices floated in from the lane. Peter and Evan passed the window, walking with books under their arms and the comfortable air of boys who had once been frightened, but were no longer afraid. Miss Marple's gaze followed them until they vanished beyond the hedge. "I often think," she said softly, "that evil in the village doesn't hide in shadows, but in habits, in what we're willing to excuse and who we're willing to protect." Groves nodded. "And it's people like you who keep the rest of us honest." "Oh, I hope not," she said, chuckling again. "I rather dislike honesty. Truth, however, that is something else entirely." She lifted her teacup and took the final sip, satisfied. The larks sang over Stansfield once more. The parish bells rang out the hour, and though the secrets of the vestry would not be forgotten, Life, quiet, sharp, and infinitely human, resumed with all the steadiness of spring. And Miss Marple, as ever, returned to her knitting,